this section, we're going to look at the interaction between the researcher and the videographer. Now, you might actually do the filming yourself, or you might get somebody else to do it for you. If you do it yourself, it's actually the most cost-effective way of doing it, but that hugely depends on the style of project and whether you feel confident to do that. If it's an ethnography type project and you're following, observing, and not necessarily engaging with the respondent, that's possible to do. If, however, you're having to refer to notes quite a bit, or you're asking lots of questions, you probably need two people, somebody else to handle the camera. If you do want to do your own filming and you're not confident, you can, of course, get yourself some practical training in that field. But let's look at some of the types of things you need to consider. So this is really getting down to how long is it going to take and how much is it going to cost. So you need to think about the number of respondents, obviously, the length of each session. Are you conducting the sessions sequentially or running them in parallel? Because that all has an effect on how many days is it going to take, how many camera operators do you need, and the amount of equipment. Number of days, well, these are really approximate costs, incredibly approximate costs, because it does vary and it depends on the style of the project. You're maybe talking roughly 200 to 250 per camera operator per day. There are some less, there are some more. The more camera operators you have, the more expensive, but you might be able to conduct the study in a significantly shorter period of time. So you just have to balance all these things out. If it's a large study, the video company might actually have to hire extra equipment. It just depends on the size of the study. But it's not just the filming that costs, it's the editing. And the most common complaint is, it was only 5 minutes video. Why did it cost me, I don't know, 400, 500, 600 pounds? Well, you've got 10 hours of video material crunched down into 5 minutes, and it actually takes rather a large number of days to work through that and edit it down. So you are paying by the day, and that's where a lot of the, or by the hour sometimes, and that's where a lot of the costing comes from. So I'm going to go back to this chart that you saw before, because this really does affect the edit and therefore the timings. Okay. So you might be in a very basic meeting where you would be using individual clips. You might be giving a spoken presentation and just using individual clips that support your presentation. If you're in a wider meeting where there are other people involved, you might want more of a sort of nice edit, something fairly simple, a few introductory graphics and some text captions. You might be using simple captions here across the video if you're not using voiceover, and just use captions. Be aware here of captions and keep them stationary, because the brain cannot cope with watching moving video and watching moving captions text at the same time. So keep your captions stationary. Now, if you're getting into the bigger type of meeting and you're presenting to maybe the key stakeholders, you might want to be a bit more creative with your editing style here. You might want to be a little bit more funky, but do be extremely careful of funky over content. Depending on your audience, depending on what you're trying to get across, if the content's not there but it looks pretty damn good, you do actually get your client coming back and saying, well, great imagery, but it doesn't actually tell me anything. So do be very careful, but it really, really depends on the type of project, and if you're trying to get across the analytical details, or if you're really getting more of a creative feel across, but the rest of the presentation goes into detail, then that works hand in hand. Okay. If it's more about technical research and development, unless that more detailed content is in there, which lets them action the information, it can actually irritate the client. So funky is brilliant. Just watch the context that it's being used in. if you are trying to explain more complex behavior or models, you can actually start to bring in more graphics. Here we have a flowchart. Okay. And the flowchart was actually quite complicated, and in this case ran over about 3 separate pages. It really was quite complex. The flowchart on its own, sometimes you have data and charts there. It gives you the detailed information. It's not very engaging, and it doesn't always illustrate really what's happening, what's going on. However, in this situation, if you only had a series of video for each of those different stages, it would be quite confusing because of the complexity of this model. If you combine the two, you can have voiceover, it's taking you through the flowchart, you get to a certain place in the flowchart, video, your video comes out, you see what's happening, the video then goes back in and you move on. So you can be a bit more creative when you're trying to explain more complex information. If it's going to be a more visual record of the whole story, this is the full head. Charts, data, motion graphics, voice, music, and this is quite complex and takes much longer to do, but very powerful.
To put washing into context, it's important to know whether people use machines or hand wash. Countries mainly wash by hand. However, the machine market is significantly growing in these regions, especially towards semi-automatic machines. Areas such as already have a high number of machines, but they are still growing, as well as upgrading from semi to fully automatic machines. The water source clearly affects where and how the laundry is done and how the water is collected.
But it's not just about the creative input from the editor, it's also about the administrative input that tells the editor what is required. Roughly, again, costs vary, maybe 200, 250 a day, actually sometimes less, maybe 150 a day, but some people charge by the hour, and the hourly rate can vary hugely, absolutely huge. Okay. Now, dodgy video files. If the video company has taken the video, it is clearly their responsibility to sort out any technical hitches. However, if the researcher has taken the video, then the editor will charge for solving the technical problems. Whichever way, you really do need to build time into the project to allow for technical problems, because they do happen, whoever's responsibility it is. But in order to help you tell the editor what to do, you can build into your analysis which clips that you want and where they are as you're going along and doing the analysis. Now, I'm not attempting in these charts to go into detailed teaching, because everybody does things a different way, but this is just to get across an idea of how to go about it so that you can brief the editor as to what you want. Everybody has their own individual methods. This is just one way. You would, for example, set up a spreadsheet. You would have all your respondents across the top, and then as you're going through your analysis, you would be writing down the different things that you're wanting to look at as you're going through the analysis. This example is very specific to a technical observation. So you would then, this is somebody washing the dishes, as you're going through your video clips and looking at them, you say, right, respondent number 1 at this position in the film, here's what they're doing. Respondent number 1, when they're opening the cupboard at this position, here they are. And you would gradually fill in your sheet and just build that up. You might put in text, you might put in different colors, you might put in anything that allows you to go back at the end and say, right, I want this, 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 and this, and I can tell the editor what to do. So when it moves on to the editor, you have the same list. Here are all the things that you want, but across the top you're now saying, right, I want this respondent at this point in the film, and I want this respondent at this point in the film. It's really tedious, but if you do that whilst you're doing the analysis, it is incredibly efficient when that gets handed over to the editor and they know exactly what they're doing. That cuts down time, that cuts down cost. So it's very prescriptive. It might not suit everybody. It certainly doesn't suit all types of edit. If the video is of the more funky variety, it's not going to fit into that. And you need to have a very good relationship with your video editor and trust their judgment as well. It's hard to give up a degree of control, but if the edit is to be more creative or more funky, you do need to be able to trust your editor's judgment as well. So coming back to timing and costs, if it's just individual clips, maybe 1.5 days, simple edit, few captions, maybe 3 to 4 days, and I'm always using the word maybe. Okay? If you're getting into the more creative style, this is where it starts to get more vague, anywhere between 8 and 14 days. And if you're going for the full hit, you're maybe talking two working weeks, 14 working days, perhaps more, perhaps less. Okay. So just starting to wrap up now, you will have spoken to your client in huge detail to get how are they going to use the video, who are you going to present to, and that lets you know the type, the length of study, and the style of communication, which you can then brief the video editor. Unfortunately, what often happens is that the researcher comes to the video company and they write it out and said, can you give me a cost, when actually a lot of the detail is not yet known, and that does lead to problems when not enough information is known. Then clearly both parties working very much hand in hand during the detailed project planning, through the fieldwork, and then into that final stage where when the researcher is doing their analysis, the video editor can then be downloading, structuring the project and getting themselves organized so that when the researcher has done their analysis and maybe also worked out the style of their presentation, they can then give the researcher, the editor the instructions, and then that goes into the editing stage. So, one last word on administration before I wrap up. Who holds the original footage? Do you agree that right from the outset? It is extremely important. Sometimes the client very often usually doesn't want the raw material. So the researchers then in that situation of, do they hold on to it or does the video company hold on to it? The researcher is the best company to hold on to because the client might come back in a few weeks' time, and even in 6 months' time, and say, I want another edit, I want a smaller edit of what you did before. So you do need to agree where that material is being held. If you have a good relationship with your video company, they will hold on to it for you for an agreed period of time, but not indefinitely. So to finish, what makes a successful outcome? The researcher has to really dig between the surface of the client's briefing because the client might necessarily give you everything that you need to know. Plan for how you will use the video versus how the client will use the video, and the analysis versus the communication. Do provide very precise editing instructions to the editor. Don't underestimate the additional time needed for you to draw up the editing plan, and do include enough time for the editing when you're putting the plan together. So I hope that's been useful to you. Thank you very much indeed for your attention, and I will now hand back to Arthur.